All right. Thank you so much for joining today. The Trusted Sec webinar on navigating the penetration testing landscape. My name is Stephen Marshowitz, Director of Program Development here at Trusted Sec. And we get questions about different pen tests, and they come up all the time. It truly is one name with many meanings. So today we hope to assist with explaining some of the differences to help you decide what is best for you. First, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to go back and review it on our YouTube page, or if you go to our main site and the links under events, you'll be able to see it there along with other events and future events. We definitely encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A along the way, and we'll make sure that we get to them either during or at the end of the presentation. Quick background on Trusted Sec. And really the key in everything to our success is the people. That's where it all starts. We share knowledge across 90 consultants, probably more than that now, experiences from over 500 plus assessments we do a year, the research on the latest threats, creating new exploits and tools, and the innovation with a keen focus on new services and customizing technical and advisory assessments to your particular needs. A few services to highlight, since we're going to obviously be talking a lot about security testing and analysis offerings. Wanted to focus in a little bit on the remediation services and assistance that we provide there. Some of the things we do with both remediation, once you have something going wrong or we found something, and automation is our hardening reviews. These have become incredibly popular, especially with all the new technologies coming out from Office 365, Azure, AWS, Active Directory, and even DevSecOps hardening. They've been super popular and important, and they really give you a broad spectrum of insights from both the CIS benchmarks and as well as Trusted Sec's other tests that we do and the other teams that we pull together. The last review I saw had over 75 pages, so there's a lot of value there, and you definitely want to check it out along with what we're going to be talking about today. So I wanted to, with that, want to introduce our speakers. We're really excited to have them today. Fresh off the speaking and training tour, one in particular is already doing it right now, but Melvin Langvick and Jason Lang. Melvin, would you start us off and give us a little background about yourself and potentially Jason?
Sure. Thank you so much. So my name is Melvin Langvick. I go by the alias Langvick, pretty much everywhere, Twitter, GitHub. I used to be a developer, so I used to work predominantly with the C# programming language. I worked with the Azure cloud environment, creating integration solutions for customers having more legacy on-prem systems and wanting to move up to the cloud. I was extremely lucky in breaking into the information security field and eventually landed the job at Trusted Sec, where I'm a part of the target operations team under my boss, I should say, then Jason Lang. I don't know if Jason has managed to join us, if he wanted to introduce himself as well. Jason, you here, or should I take it? I don't think he's here.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I get to introduce my own boss then. So Jason Lang is the practice lead at Target Operations. He has years of experience behind him. I know him specifically as a Unix, Linux guru. And we make sure to let him know whenever he's having issues, because he's running Linux and absolutely everything during meetings and stuff as well. So I'm sure we can get back to Lang later on during the webinar in terms of him being able to answer some questions and fill in some gaps if we miss them during the show. And I think with that, we're ready to get started here. So let me move on. So this webinar is called Navigating the Penetration Testing Landscape. And it's meant to give you an understanding of the absolutely most common penetration tests out there, or I shouldn't say penetration tests, I should say types of offensive information security testing. There are so many more, some very specific, and we are going to go through the absolutely most common ones, and those will help you get a better understanding of even the more specific ones. And with that, let's get started. So I do really like this picture and this meme because it really illustrates a bit of an industry-wide problem that we see. So a lot of clients and a lot of other consulting companies are having, I wouldn't say they disagree, but they're having sort of different meanings behind testing. So if you go to, I see Jason Lang is joining as well. You know what? Let's go back a bit, and then Jason can introduce himself. Are you ready to just give yourself a 5-minute introduction, Jason? A couple minutes introduction.
5 minutes? No way, man. 30 seconds. No. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Jason Lang. I'm the practice lead of the Target Operations Group. I have the privilege of working with awesome guys like Melvin and Adam and Scott and Hans, and just the Target Operations team doing well, targeted operations. The assessments are a little, shall we say, it's like more advanced in terms of like length of time and target focus and that sort of thing. And it really is a pleasure. So goals of this, and as I'm sure Melvin will get into, is really just talk through pen testing and what that means and what does that look like, going through it and that sort of thing. Purpose and overview. I'm already ahead of you. And so anyways, I'm gonna turn it back over to you before I embarrass myself. Thanks again, everyone. Great being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. Okay, so back to where we left off real quick there. So again, in the industry, both between consultant houses as ourselves practicing this as well as winning clients, there is some misunderstanding between the definitions. So this meme specifically illustrates that some clients may state that they want an internal penetration test, and then what they really have in mind is what we associate with an assumed breach, and vice versa. And this can create confusion, and this can, in worst case, create a scenario where you end up ordering something, and then up until the point where you're receiving it, then you understand that you're actually not getting what you think you're getting. And yeah, so hopefully this webinar will help you clear up those definitions and give you a better understanding when you're going into ordering or looking into getting one of these sort of tests. Some caveats though, because we have to make sure we don't step on any toes here. So while we as TrustedSec absolutely have experience in the field and we consider ourselves accurate when it comes to this information, this is not the end all be all for every test and definition that is out there. This is our definitions based on our experience in the industry as well as our internal methodology. So I can 100% say that if you go to us and you ask, you want and you request one of the tests that we're about to talk about, then these definitions will align with that. But I can't guarantee that when you go to another consultant house or another company asking for this sort of tests, that this will be 100% correct in terms of what they define it as. I personally believe it should be, but it might not always be the case. And there is also one big caveat, and that is maturity. So when it comes down to what sort of testing you should get, what aligns with your current maturity model and stuff like that, that is a one-on-one conversation that we cannot have with 74 attendees in the webinar. So sadly, we'll try very hard to avoid the M word, the maturity word. We have to touch upon it later on in the webinar, but we will, just understand that we're not trying to have like a maturity discussion. That is something, again, one-on-one, and that is much more time consuming than a 45-minute webinar for sure. Okay, so we're gonna go straight into it. We're gonna talk about definitions, and then in the end, we're gonna have call it a pop quiz or scenario. I want you guys to take a look at and try to solve. After that, we'll open for discussions and questions. I personally would really love to see a broader discussion after the webinar. I think it's way easier for you guys to sort of take this information and apply it in your real life, in your heads and in your examples after the webinar than just listening to me forever. So let's talk about some definitions. So let's talk about the first definition we have, or the first sort of testing I want to talk about, which is vulnerability assessment. Yeah, I was like, what was that saying? Vulnerability assessment. And the main goal of a vulnerability assessment is to identify and rank exposures, mainly using automated tools. This is what you would call an automated vulnerability scan. This is something that, depending on the environment or the size of the environment, takes very little time. It's typically performed using automated tools. And typically, those tools spits out sort of an automated report with exposures that tool defines. And then you would sort of go through that and try to fix it. Or try to confirm the misconfigurations as well as try to correct them. A vulnerability assessment is very effective at identifying misconfigurations, unsupported software, and missing software patches. I want to be clear that there is, okay, also we'll talk about it a bit later, but a vulnerability assessment is often considered the starting point for organizations. So again, we're sort of touching upon the maturity word here, but often, say an organization, 10, 30, 40, 50 employees, haven't really had either the budget, individuals, or time dedicated to security, this is something you can do when you want to get a quick overview and a quick touch upon all your bases in terms of what sort of assets you are sitting on. A lot of the time, companies do have a longer technical depth, and they don't even know what sort of assets they might be sitting on, if they don't have correct procedures scoring up and stuff like that. So this is something that will help you identify those assets and potentially also point out exposures and misconfigurations within those assets that you can quickly fix. Authenticated versus unauthenticated. And this is a big one. So a lot of automated tools that are used in vulnerability assessments just scans or looks at the external or internal, for that matter, or resources that a company have from an unauthenticated standpoint, meaning that the scanner itself cannot access the login portal as a user and look at the menus past that login point. And that might give you sort of a false sense of security because it can't reach behind those login portals and it can't reach behind endpoints that need credentials in order to be able to access. And that's why if you're doing a vulnerability assessment, I would ask, and I would somewhat specify that you are doing both an authenticated and an unauthenticated vulnerability assessment to be sure that you get those endpoints that require authentication looked at as well, possible exposures behind that authentication layer. One of the things that when we talk about all sort of testing, except one, which we'll talk about in the very end, all testing is restricted by both time and scope. And it's kind of interesting because time and scope is something that does not restrict attackers. Attackers does not care about time. They'll spend how much time they want to spend hunting down exposures in your infrastructure, as well as scope. An attacker doesn't have scope. They'll attack whatever they find. If it's an open service, it's an open service. It doesn't matter for them who owns the service or if it's within scope. So it's also very important that when you do these sort of assessments, if it's a vulnerability assessment or if it's an external internal penetration test that we'll talk about afterwards, that be aware that everything is restricted by scope and that how you define that scope can impact the tests rather dramatically. So be aware of that. That's basically vulnerability assessment. That is sort of a starting point for many organizations. Moving on to the application test. So an application test is highly effective at identifying application-specific exposures. So an applications test is very typical if you have, say, an in-house application that you develop, and then before testing or after testing, before production release, you do an application or web application test towards that application to make sure that it doesn't have any underlying exposures that somebody, once released could exploit. And what is very different between an application or web application test and an vulnerability assessment is that an application test is manual. It's highly manual. It's often considered very technical, and it requires time and very sort of labor-intensive manual effort in order to identify exposures. I would say that, again, this is also one of the sort of downsides with a vulnerability assessment. Why a vulnerability assessment is still good at identifying resources, it might not go to the technical depth that an application or web application test will. So you could scan one web app and get a decent report from the automated scanner, but then you throw a highly trained individual at that application trying to find exposures, and the result will be very different. Or could be very different, I should say. There are three common approaches when it comes to application testing: black box, gray box, and white box. These three approaches refer to how much information or access the attacker has. So a black box would be, please hack this web applications, find as many exposures as you can, but we will not give you access to any account. So if you want to get access to an account, you have to hack your way into the system and get access to an account. And that might be realistic for some applications, once they hit productions and they're exposed to the internet or whatever. But it might hide sort of an internal layer of exposure or of attack surface that you can find because it's behind an authentication wall. And then you have gray box. Typically, that means that there's a sort of a middle layer between white box and black box. So the attacker does have some access to the web application. Typically, that's a user or a couple of users, so you can check for IDORs. And that is, in my opinion, it's much more less time consuming than a black box because you have access and you can browse all the menus. You don't have to try to breach all the authenticated perimeter in order to find those menus and panels. And then you have white box, which basically means you have access to everything. Typically, you even have access to source codes. And again, when you choose these, is very much comes down to time. How much time and how much resources do you want to throw at this web application? If you only have, say, you have 2 weeks, that's what you have in your budget. You have 2 weeks to perform this application test. I would probably go for either gray or white box, because that's going to save the consultant a bunch of time. You're going to get initial access, and you can even look at the source code and try to identify vulnerabilities from the source code instead of trying to hammer the API with a bunch of different requests and sort of guess your way to the vulnerability. So again, 3 common approaches. They are very much considered just based on each case and how much time you have. Again, heavily restricted by time. Time is absolutely everything when it comes to sort of testing. Moving on to an external penetration test. So an external penetration test simulates an simulates an active attack against external company resources. And again, this sounds very similar to both a vulnerability assessment and an application test. But the difference is that a web application test looks at one specific resource typically, while an external penetration test typically looks at all the external resources exposed and connected to your organization. And then external, and an EPT or external penetration test is really effective at identifying external exposures that could lead to compromise. And one also major difference between a web app and an EPT, external penetration test, is the intelligence gathering portion of it. So at least TrustedSec, when we perform external penetration tests, we start the engagement by performing open source intelligence, or OSINT gathering. And that is basically us scouring the interwebs for all sorts of information that might be related to you as a client, as a company, and the resources we are attacking. So that might be looking through GitHub, trying to see if some developer accidentally pushed some keys or some passwords to a public GitHub repo that belong to the company. That definitely happens. We have seen that time and time again. It might be overly exposed, say your website, maybe the uploads folder or files folder on the company website is overly permissive, leaving us to be able to download all files ever uploaded to the web server, and we can harvest those files for metadata information. It really expands the scope between being able to attack this resource and gathering information related to the company in order to more effectively attack those resources. And that really ties in when it comes to password spraying. And this is something we absolutely, or me at least, absolutely insist on doing when we perform external penetration tests, because the password spraying attack is by far the #1 attack surface that you see hit on a daily basis as a company. So when I say password spraying attack, the process is something like this. So I would first start off by open source intelligence gathering, and I would try to collect as many employee names and employee emails as possible. And there are numerous techniques to do this. I won't go into them in detail, but obviously LinkedIn is a big one. That's a gold mine. Being able to scrape LinkedIn for first names and last names and put them together into emails based on the email syntax we know the company is using. And then you taking those emails that we know belong to the company and performing the password spraying attack. Now, it sounds rather silly. Guessing passwords, is that really effective? How can you do that? And it is effective because you do it in a very specific sort of setup. So we take, say there's a company and we manage to find 1,000 valid emails in that company. Say the company is 5,000 employees, we managed to find 1,000 emails that are valid for the company online using open source intelligence gathering. We then take one password, say summer 2022, or I should say autumn 2022, and we spray, or we attempt that password towards all 1,000 users in one spray, in one burst. And once we've done that, we wait a period of time to avoid locking out accounts, triggering lockout policies, stuff like that. And then we take another commonly weak password and we do the exact same thing, say autumn 2022, but with an exclamation mark behind it. You do the same, we spray that, and lo and behold, you will be surprised how many times we're able to find users with those type of weak and common passwords that we can then access. And that is what we do. So we'll try maybe 30, 40, 50, we'll try as many passwords as is possible within the time frame of the engagement that are typical and commonly used and that are weak and easily guessable. And that is something that, again, the attack surface is so heavily abused from like a real attacker standpoint that I almost absolutely require clients doing an external penetration test with me to allow me to do this, because the attack surface is so heavily used. So you need to be able to, a modern client today or modern company today needs to be able to withstand the password sparing attack over a longer period of time with weak passwords. Again, an external penetration test is heavily restricted by time and scope. That is pretty much just how it is for almost all of the tests except one. Internal penetration test. So an internal penetration test, much like an external penetration test, simulates an active attacker, but that is already inside the network, meaning that it could be, it sort of falls into this assumed breach model that we'll talk about next. But for now, let's just think of it as an attacker coming on, being on the inside of your network, and it has access to everything. And that's the sort of scenario we're showing. And the reason for this is that an internal penetration test is really effective at identifying misconfigurations and vulnerabilities that lead to domain compromise from the inside. But in order to identify all those misconfigurations and vulnerabilities, we can't be restricted. Again, we're on the time frame, and we're trying to, again, during an internal penetration test, find as much as possible so you can fix as much as possible. And we'll talk more about why that might be a more unrealistic or realistic scenario based on how your company is structured and how your company works. But yeah, again, we'll talk more about why it sort of doesn't make sense, but makes sense when we get to assumed breach. So an internal penetration test, at least from TrustedSec, can be performed both on-site and fully remote. So on-site, a consultant would show up on-site, we would bring our own gear, and then we would plug onto your internet internally, and then we would start hacking. Something that has become really, really common, and that is, I would say, probably 90-95% of the cases within TrustedSec, is that we do this fully remote. So we have something called a TAP device. I think it's called a TrustedSec attack platform, which is a tiny computer that we ship out to customers, and that the customers will bring into their location, and then we'll plug it into the Ethernet and plug it into power, and then we'll be able to access this system remotely and use that system to test your internal network without being physically on site. And this is tied into TrustedSec infrastructure in a really safe way in terms of operational security. Obviously, that's always going to be a priority. One thing that is really good about the internal penetration test, even though you're sort of simulating an attacker who's on your network and can access everything, which depending on the case might not be realistic, is that it can really help both find misconfigurations, but also validate network detection capabilities and some host-based detection capabilities. One thing an internal penetration test does not test response. And that is because, again, with the internal penetration test, we are going to be restricted on time. Typically, everything from 1 to 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the size of the network. So we can deal with, say, an active response team sort of kicking us out from the network or unplugging us, powering off us, making it difficult for us, because that isn't the goal of the internal penetration test. Sure, sort of a sub byproduct of the test is that you can validate your network detection, but the goal of the test is to find as many vulnerabilities and misconfigurations as possible within the network that might lead to domain compromise. And this is the main difference between an assumed breach, which we'll talk about next. Again, restricted by time and scope. Oh no, okay, it's cloud first. It should have been assumed. Okay, but let's talk about cloud penetration test first. And this is something that is rather new within TrustedSec. I think it's just a couple of years ago, we got a dedicated cloud penetration testing team, and they test predominantly Azure and AWS. And a cloud platform, like a cloud penetration test, is very much like an external and internal penetration test, but specific for the cloud. So it is cloud platform specific. And it is really really effective at identifying misconfigurations within the cloud, and not just technical misconfigurations, but also in terms of roles and access control and privileged access management and stuff like that. And really, okay, so the realistic case is that we are not going to be able to find technical sort of holes or security vulnerabilities within Microsoft products and AWS products in 2 weeks. We will not find 0 days in Azure or the AWS within 2 weeks. I mean, we might, but that is not the goal. And that is because most of the sort of, obviously depending on what you have, but much of the infrastructure customers deploy in Azure and AWS is going to be software as a service solutions, which is going to be vulnerable if misconfigured. So it is much closer to I would say like a configuration review, but with a technical and sort of an active presence, than it is like a full-blown external or web app test. when we do these sort of cloud penetration tests, wow, we do both black box and assumed access. So black box, we usually start off that way, is that we try to map out what sort of infrastructure we have in the cloud, what are you exposing in terms of Azure and AWS. We attack that in terms of we try to identify sensitive information disclosure, overly permissive permissions defined for, say, storage accounts or blob storages. And then once we've done that, we move over to an assumed access phase. So an assumed access phase means that we are given credentials to assume the role of a user typically within the cloud environment. Typically, that's a developer. And then with that access, we are able to actually take a peek at the configurations of those resources that you have deployed from the inside and take a look at the configurations and sort of make a determination. And the same goes for access roles and privileged access management and stuff like that. Once you are on the inside, it's much easier to spot that service account that has way too many permissions than doing it from the outside, of course. So we do really, so it's more of a, we are looking for best practice. We are looking for potentially bad development hygiene, stuff like developers and maybe, architects or DevOps leaving credentials and secrets in configuration files in settings in your deployment pipelines, and what that could potentially lead to. And the very common case is that, let's say you have a custom web application that is exposed in production. In that web application, you have, or in that database or in that source code, you have included, say, the client ID and secret for an Azure service account that web application uses in order to access something. If I compromise that web app, I could extract that information potentially, and then I could compromise your Azure environment using those credentials. And it's stuff like that, just bad developer hygiene, developers or oversights leaving credentials in source code or in configuration files in plain text, or not stored in according to best practice. Again, we do look at access controls and roles, trying to determine if, again, that service account, why does that service account need to be able to, create new resources? There's no need for that in the service account. That service account is only used to deploy a zip file to that SAS solution. There's no need for all these permissions. And that is what we look at. Again, restricted by time and scope. That is something you'll see across all tests. Social engineering. Social engineering is really interesting because it might not necessarily give you the result you're expected, but it's always going to be really useful when you tie it together with a proper education and awareness program. So a social engineering test, typically a phishing campaign or a vishing campaign, is an indication of the effectiveness of your user education and awareness program. Meaning that if you have highly trained and highly aware employees, that phishing test should indicate that at least amount of people clicking, least amount of people giving away their password and usernames, etc. When we perform these sort of social engineering tests, we typically, obviously it depends on what the clients would like us to do and what they allow us to do, but typically we perform both a phishing campaign over email, as well as follow-up phone calls. And that is to try to really entice the users that might have looked at the email and thought, oh, this is probably a scam, and just ignored it. And then call them up and be like, hey, could you please answer this email? It's really urgent. Why haven't you responded? Don't you look at your email? Yada, yada. And try to really, stress them out and get them to follow instructions anyhow. And that combination is often, I feel like, an oversight in terms of steps on how other consulting companies does it. Many consulting companies and many other services is just an automated send out 1,000 emails, measure how many people click. And that is great, but I feel like when we do it like that, we set the bar rather low. I think most people, even at their most stressful day, will be able to identify low quality and sort of giveaway-ish email phishing campaigns. While obviously we don't want to be mean or we don't want to be unreasonable, but at the same time, we want to try to match the expectations and match the results that we are seeing in real life from actual attackers. Social engineering campaigns usually have different goals. So some want us to just log how many people clicked. They think that a click is an indication of intent. Some want us to do credential harvesting, meaning that they will have to click and then we have to give away their password and username. And then we can see how many actually clicked and gave away their password and username. And some want us to try to get remote access on the system, meaning that the email campaign itself would be a bit more complex and would require the user to follow usually a couple of steps in instruction in order to install something or execute something or run something on their system so that we can gain access to their system. And then that would be sort of the metric that we measure it by. And all of these goals sort of align with how far you want to push it in terms of realism. But end of the day, a social engineering campaign is there to measure the effectiveness of the program, meaning that a log and a click should technically just be enough. Because if you see a really sketchy email, you're supposed to hit that report button and leave it alone. You aren't supposed to click on anything, right? Again, social engineering campaign is restricted by time. And now I think we should get to assumed breach. There we go, assumed breach. So I think this slide probably should have been after the internal penetration test, but we'll talk about it nonetheless. So an assumed breach, much like the internal penetration test, simulates an active attacker working from the inside, but the assumed breach case takes the assumption that you're working from a compromised machine. You're assuming that you're working post-compromise. And why is this different from an internal penetration test? Well, me working through a machine, like an actual compromised machine, a workstation issued by the company, is going to impose restrictions on me that I did not have on the internal penetration test, which is more realistic because, typically, statistically, I should say, when companies get breached, it's because typically business email compromise, they get a either their account compromised or they get an email on the full instructions and they take over the control of their computer. But that is sort of the main difference, that we're working from the computer in an assumed breach, and the internal penetration test, you're working without restrictions on a device on the network. And this is also why these two tests have different, I wouldn't say goals, but they're effective at different things. So an assumed breach is really effective at identifying weak points in technical controls, as well as potentially compromising the domain. If you look at a report, if you take an assumed breach report and you take an internal penetration test report, an internal penetration test report is going to have a bunch of findings. It's going to have technical findings related to everything we found in the system, and that we mean can be remediated and that could be corrected. While an assumed breach might have some of those findings, the goal of an assumed breach is more to challenge your technical controls as well as trying to find vulnerabilities. So an assumed breach won't have the same sort of effectiveness at finding as many vulnerabilities as possible compared to an internal penetration test. And the model, so we have something called a trusted insider, which is a methodology that we use or we prefer to use when we do assumed breaches. And that is that me and the point of contact, which is typically the point of contact for the company that we're performing testing for, the point of contact would pick out an individual in the company, typically somebody who isn't technical, somebody who doesn't work in a group that might have elevated permissions, somebody that might see a lot of exposure in terms of emails and phishing and stuff like that. Typically, that's going to be sales, HR, maybe legal, stuff like that. They might see an increase in that compared to IT and technical. They pick up one employee working within those groups, and then me and that employee sit down together, and then we intentionally compromise their machine so I have something to work off. And the reason we do this is, again, we're trying to keep it as realistic as possible. I want to work off an actual machine that has real user activity, has a real user logging on in the morning and logging off at night, a user with data that I can actually look at and try to understand what the internal network looks like and stuff like that, because that is really crucial in sort of simulating a real attacker post-compromise on that machine. Yeah. So I would say that an assumed breach simulates real-life compromises more accurately than an internal penetration test. An internal penetration test is still extremely effective at finding all those misconfigurations, finding all those vulnerabilities at a much greater speed than an assumed breach, and a much wider sort of scope than an assumed breach. But an assumed breach, from just purely statistically how companies get compromised, is better at simulating that real life, a computer got hacked and the hacker is trying to deploy ransomware or steal data or whatever. And unlike internal penetration tests, this sort of test can actually validate your EDR, XDR, MDR detection capabilities, but typically not response. So while we would like, during the assumed breach, we tell the point of contact that, if your EDR solution pops up with a warning or an alert, if your MDR, let's say you have a third-party MDR, if they respond and they let you know that something is going on, great. Send us a screenshot. We'll include that in the report, but please don't take any action on it. And that is because, again, we don't want to waste time getting kicked out of the machine and having to redeploy, but we want to confirm and we want to validate your detection capabilities. So we include that in the report. Great, you detected us, and then we continue working on and see if we can find this configuration within the domain in order to elevate privileges or reach some goal that we set before the engagement. Again, typically restricted by time and scope. Hopefully this gives you a better impression of what an internal penetration test is and what that is good at compared to what an assumed breach is and what that is good at. And the reason we had that meme at the beginning is because these are the two things that are often misunderstood or mistaken for one each other. Okay, red team. So tip of the iceberg, right? So what's called an adversarial attack simulation, commonly referred to as a red team, simulates a sophisticated attacker conducting precision attacks over a prolonged period of time. And again, the main difference between this and an assumed breach is that in a red team, we have to get in on the machine. We have to, once we get into the machine, we have to stay there undetected, and we have to move slowly and try to reach the goals set by the engagement. And the time period is going to be way bigger than an assumed breach. We're talking minimum 6 weeks, and I would still call a 6-week red team a short to barely sort of thing. And it's really interesting because I see this blowing up on Twitter and social media all the time. The emulation versus simulation. And a lot of people get this wrong when they buy this sort of services. So we at TrustedSec, we perform simulation. And simulation means that we are allowed to take inspiration from whatever threat actor we want, if we want to. We are allowed to come up with our own procedures, techniques, and tactics if we want to. The main thing is that we're trying to simulate an advanced attacker attacking you, and we can sort of use our internal techniques and methodologies in order to do so and reach our goal. But when you emulate, when you perform an adversarial emulation, you actually copy the threat actor. So if somebody sells you, hey, we want to do a red team with you, and we're going to emulate APT 29 or whatever, I don't know, not so good with the APT numbers, but some APT out there, advanced persistent threat, which is a mapped and known threat actor. We want to emulate them. Then we would have to go in and follow exactly the techniques and TTPs and the methods that actor uses when they perform attacks towards you, so you can see how you would stand up against that specific threat. Now, we do simulation because we think that is the sort of brings more value than doing emulation, as well as that emulation will typically hold, depending on how advanced of a threat actor you're emulating, emulation will typically hold you back in terms of bleeding edge techniques and methodology and coming up with new stuff, compared to simulation, where you're allowed to use those sort of techniques and come up with your own methodology. And red team separates itself from all the other tests in that we do sort of, I don't want to say everything, but we're allowed to do phishing. We're allowed to do obviously technical, trying to breach the company using a technical identified vulnerability, but also physical, meaning that, again, if it's obviously agreed upon with the client, we do actual physical assessments against company locations, trying to tailgate employees in. Will they just let us in if we look official? Maybe pick some locks. We use some tools in order to open doors from the outside. If physical boundaries and controls are installed incorrectly, they can easily be bypassed. And once we get on the inside, we try to either deploy technical devices so we can perform a technical hack, or we just go for the data center or interesting data, or in terms of actual paper that might be around the building and not secured, right? And that is one of the sort of main differences between all other types of testing, is that we can do all of this together over a prolonged period of time, simulating a real attacker, a really motivated and and economically capable attacker going after your company. And that is also why red teaming is considered very sort of tip of the iceberg, bleeding edge, and I won't say only, but commonly you have to reach a very, very high level of maturity. I said the word, I shouldn't have said it. Really high level of maturity before you conduct a red team engagement, or it might not bring the sort of value that you're looking for. Again, one of the main differences between a red team and other tests is that it's not scope-based. It's purely goal-based, meaning that during the engagement kickoff call, before the engagement starts, the point of contact for the company would tell me, hey, our worst case scenario is that you run away with this data, or that you encrypt these servers, or that you stop the production environment, or you steal source code, whatever. And then we try to reach that goal, and we have to sort of dynamically, as we go along, identify what belongs to your company and what belongs to somebody else's company. Well, there are really good resources for doing this, so there aren't really any overlap in terms of accidentally sidetracking and attacking somebody else. Obviously, we wouldn't want to do that. But it isn't scope-based, so that the client doesn't restrict us to, okay, you can only attack this IP range between 7 and 4. It's not like that, because an attacker does not care about scope. They want to get in and they want to fulfill the goals and they want to make money. Research and development is critical for an advanced red team to function. And we are really proud, extremely proud at Trusted Tech to have our own research and development team internally. They are all, I want to say all, 90% ex-government, meaning that they are highly skilled at what they do. And they produce out some of the most incredible stuff that we get to play with and that we get to use during engagements, which is amazing. So we're really, really, really proud to have that. Moving on to, I think, our final sort of slide of definitions, a purple team, which is an adversarial detection and countermeasures test. And this is not the same as a red team, in that this is much more controlled and this is much more isolated, and this is specifically to generate defensive security controls. It is really effective at evaluating the level of information security program you have. Is it effective? Is it not effective? Is it hitting all the spots that we think it is, or do we have blind spot that we thought was under control, but that actually in real life doesn't turn out to trigger an alarm at all? And the main point of a purple team is to sit together actively with the client and pump out as many detection, deflection, and deterrences that we can possibly pump out based on common TTPs. So we would sit down on site typically, or virtually, with the client, and I would run a couple of attacks, and then the client would see, hey, I see this, and then we would create rules for those attacks so they can alert it in the future. And that is the whole goal of the purple team, just to really beef up your defense on a technical level. Not as in the red team to see what will happen and to sort of simulate the real threat, but to sort of prepare yourself for it. So a purple team is commonly sort of the last step before a red team. Again, I'm not talking about maturity, but statistically, I would say a purple team is commonly the last step before you go all out for a red team. Okay, so we have a test for you guys. So we have oh wow, okay, nice. Okay, this is something else. This is a poll that come up now. I think you could just ignore the poll for now. But so there's two types of in this sort of place the test. There's two type of hypothetical companies. There's company A and company B. Company A has 1,000+ employees. They have an outsourced MDR provider, and then they have an internal EDR deployed across all endpoints, and a SIM solution that gathers telemetry from all those endpoints. They do multiple tests a year, and they have a solid awareness training program. That's company A. And then company B, they have a bit smaller employee count, 500+. They have no SOC, they have no SIM. Don't ignore the poll. They have Microsoft Defender. They don't have any expensive EDR, XDR solution. They just have plain old Microsoft Defender. They do one test a year because that is what the budget allows, and they have also do awareness training. Now there are 3 tests on the screen. I want you to try to place one test to company A, and then one test to company B. I'm not going to say the maturity word, oops, but just based on what you're seeing, which test would be aligned with which company, and you can just write that in the chat all at once so we can all see it. I'll give you half a minute to do that if you want to participate in the test, the place the test. And if no one want to participate, that's fine as well. Just put it out in your head. Okay, so the answer, or my suggestion for an answer, is that the company A should get an assumed breach, and that company B should have an internal penetration test. And I see one contestant is correct here. And the reason for that is that an assumed breach would not provide as much value for company B as an internal penetration test, because company B cannot confirm their technical controls because they don't have an EDR, they don't have an MDR, and they don't have a SIM. So they, after the engagement is over, it will probably end along the lines of, you guys were unable to detect us, we were able to fulfill our goals. And what is the value of that? What is the value in that, right? That's why I think company B should get the internal penetration test. They should map out all their stuff. They should try to get misconfiguration fixed, and then they should try to increasingly mature over time and maybe get a SIM, maybe get a SOC, a virtual SOC, maybe an MDR. And then that's the value for them in terms of doing an internal penetration test. And the assumed breach is going to give company A lot of value because they can actually confirm based on telemetry how their technical control stood up against an advanced adversary on the network. And it gives more value for them simply. So that was the answer. My suggestion was, and that's pretty much it. Thank you very much. I really hope we can open up for discussion and answer some questions. I think I already went through this in blazing speed. So please, hopefully we can get a discussion going with some questions. So we have one question coming from an anonymous attendee. What role does a web application scanner play in an external penetration test? So good question. So typically when we perform external penetration tests, we usually like to finish off the external penetration test with an automated web application scan. And that is to make sure that we cover the full scope and make sure that we didn't accidentally miss anything, or that we didn't have an oversight initially in the test. But we are very specific in that we don't, when we do perform external penetration tests, that we don't start off with an automated scan and then follow up those findings. We start manual, we start using the tools we are good at, and we start identifying vulnerabilities, and then we finish off with an automated scan to make sure that we didn't accidentally miss anything. And another attendee, can you provide an example on why a company would choose emulation versus simulation? That's a good question. So it depends on what sort of threats you are facing. Like if you have good insight, you might, and you may be threat hunting, you might actually know what sort of threat that you are facing on a daily basis, what sort of threat actors, or even specifically what type of threat actor is commonly going after you. And in that case, it might make more sense to do an emulation than a simulation. It might make more sense to emulate the threat actor that you know actively are going after you. I know this is typically common in finance. A simulation would probably be, depending on who you go with, would probably be like a technical nod up than the emulation part.
I've also seen some organizations request this, like APT Iran runs PowerShell, heavily against a utility company, and then other utility companies are like, hey, what's going to happen if if these same commands get run here? Are we going to see that? And so I think your answer is exactly right, which is it really depends on the threat model that we're considering here. And personally, I would say, generally speaking, I try and dissuade people from going for emulation-based exercises where it's like, emulate this particular threat actor. And the answer is, well, why? Are we very, very concerned about that threat actor? If so, why? Have they been up against you? Are they, have they compromised you? Is that something that we're specifically focused? Generally speaking, my recommendation for stuff like that is go with something that's more like a purple team assessment, which is it's going to be a mishmash of commands from all threat actors that we at least have TTPs for, as well as stuff that we've done ourselves. And you're likely to get better value out of that than really trying to kind of pigeonhole the assessment into a specific APT group or something like that.
100%. And I think you wanted to chime in as well, or Steve? No? Okay.
No.
Okay.
I just, I was going to go through some other questions that we had come in through the chat, but we have a lot in the Q&A as well. So you can just.
Oh yeah, okay, there's the chat as well. Okay, I'll just continue picking out some from the Q&A. Thanks for a great presentation. Thank you so much. What happens when performing an assumed breach and your attacks are stopped by the EDR? Good question. So typically this is determined before the test. And depending on how much time we have, I usually say that once we hit the point where we get detected and the EDR, XDR either shuts us down or alerts, and you could reasonably assume that the information security team would shut us down, we disable the EDR and we continue the test, because then we have reached one of the goals during the assumed breach, and that is to confirm that the EDR, XDR was able to detect and that what sort of actions you were taken. Now, if you have enough time, you might redeploy onto another machine, and we might deploy another set of techniques and procedures that we know work, and so forth. It depends on time, but typically you just say, okay, you detected, great, let's continue the test and try to find stuff on the inside to keep gaining more value. I'm just going to pick these out in any random order. So sorry if you already submitted and didn't hear yours, but roughly how many passes? Yeah, sorry.
Can I jump in and I want to hit Mauricio's question real quick, because he asked a great one right at the end. And don't get me wrong, but the other ones we'll get to all the questions here. But Mauricio said, do you ever get customers that want an assessment you think is not a right fit for them, and would you still do it, or would you try and convince them to pick the right one? I love this question, and the reason why I love this question is because it hits on the business of security, like the actual business side of it. And as consultants, I'm going to speak very, very frankly here, mostly because that's my style. But don't get me wrong, like it's good to do this job. This is a very fun and rewarding job, and it's a lot of fun to work with our clients that are at all different levels of maturity and that sort of thing. However, to directly answer your question, yes, we get customers frequently that want assessments that are not necessarily right, or that I should say that we think are right for them based on how they're describing their maturity. What do we do if that comes up and they're like, hey, we want this test, we want a red team. I read it in CISO-Mag, I want a red team, I want a 2-month red team. They're like, great, that's fantastic. Tell us about your detections. Well, we have Norton Antivirus. Okay. How frequently have you done pen testing? Like, well, we've been doing external pen tests for a few years. Like, do you have a SIM? No. The answer is that even though a red team on the business side is a lucrative a gig, that is something that I would directly tell the client, don't buy this. And much to the chagrin of salespeople, I don't work in sales. My job is to make sure that the client gets the very best value for every dollar that they spend. So, if I can discern from what they're describing as their environment and hear what they're saying, is be like, listen, I understand where you're coming from. I know this is the assessment you want. I would strongly urge you to go here and go here and go here first. And then, maybe next year, put red team on the books for something like that. After you've had a chance to fix some of the low hanging fruit, you're just going to get more value out of it that way. So I have had clients that say, something to the effect of, this is what we want. This is what we're going to buy. Are you going to sell it to us? And the answer is yes, we will. If they really, 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 really want it, despite our best guidance to the contrary, well, then yes, well, sure we will. But at the same point in time, I'm going to try and guide, bring my expertise to bear and say, you are going to get better value for your money, because these do cost money. That's just a unfortunate reality. Like I said, the business of security, these do cost money. So you're going to get the best value for your money if we get you going down this road. And normally when it's phrased in that way, I think that's something that everybody relates to. Everyone understands that these tests cost money, but it's like, if I'm going to spend all this money, I want to get the best value for it. And that's how that's how I phrase it to clients, which is that your value is going to be maximized going here instead of going here. But if you tell us, no, we got to go here, we're like, okay, here we go.
And I definitely agree with that. In the end, we do really like to try to match our service offerings with what we think the client is reasonable to get value from. But hey, if you insist, we won't be rude and tell you no, right? Awesome answer there. So I'm going to go back to the roughly how many passwords do you typically try doing a password spraying attack? It all depends on time. Depends on time and depends on the lockout policy of the customer. So typically I like to spray one password Sorry about this. Well, I like to spray one password every 90 minutes. So if I have 2 weeks, then I can get through X amount of passwords. Somebody do the math. And then based on the results and based on how it goes, I might be able to generate like a custom, how much time we have. Maybe I'll generate a custom list of passwords that are based on other information that I found during OSINT. Might be more possible to get hit. Are there any open source example which shares cloud implementation deficiencies, like cloud penetration testing for known issues? We should have had some of our cloud guys on the call to answer that one. You know what? I'll hit up Paul, and then if we get an answer from him before, then great. If not, then I could try to get in touch with you later and try to get some resources on that. But I don't have any specifically in mind right now because I'm not on the cloud team. I am going to ask Paul though.
While you're doing that, I can, when this is how likely is that two different pen testers targeting the same environment with different findings? How likely is it? I would say it's likely that you're most definitely going to have overlap. And I have seen this because I have seen other pen test reports from other companies. To a certain degree, we're finding the same things, and no doubt they've seen reports from TrustedSec, and that's just to a certain degree how it goes. Like if you're doing enumeration, you're on a network, and you're like, hey, security, you click that folder, and you're like, oh, here's a pen test from last year. Let's see what they found. Some are really just trash. Like if you get an internal pen test report, that's a PDF, like 500 pages of Nmap output, find yourself a different provider. But that being the case, if you take two high quality firms, and I'm not afraid to call out some of my friends on the call and stuff like that. TrustedSec is a fantastic firm. If we also understand groups have to rotate. If you're going with other high quality firms like NetSpy or Black Hills or things like that, chance there's most definitely going to be some overlap, and I've seen this overlap for myself. However, there's going to be some different things. So for example, Justin Bollinger on our Force team, he was really the guy that pioneered the Cisco CUCM attack path, and that got us into networks via Cisco phones. I mean, who thinks of that kind of stuff? He just found that. So is that kind of really niche tradecraft going to overlap? No, not necessarily, but a lot of the Active Directory stuff is going to overlap. Like SMB not signed, a lot of the certificate stuff that you're going to see. Yes, there is most definitely going to be some overlap, but the differences that you're going to see are going to be the niche differences that are the result of the various companies' tradecraft. And that's also one of the reasons why, quite frankly, I love seeing clients, come back year after year, because our tradecraft is always changing. However, we also understand, compliance is what it is, and you might have to roll off to a different company. If that's the case, I tell my clients, ask me. I have friends in the industry. Melvin has friends in the industry. We're happy to get you paired up with people that we also trust, to take care of you, and you'll get a different aspect, or a different, different methodology, but the different niche research projects that those organizations have developed that we have not developed, you'll get all the benefit of that as well. So
there is probably sales probably doesn't like us telling you this, but there is definitely a plus side to sometimes rotate between who does the testing to make sure you're getting full coverage. I think that is a fair statement, or I think that is just wild, Jason.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yep. So okay, so question. So if you're Microsoft, you're likely want to have an Apt emulation since you're likely to be targeted. Yes and no. I guess, Jason, you want to chime in on this? I recall Microsoft probably having their own internal red team, right?
Yes. Yeah. Wouldn't surprise me if some MS people were on the call. As far as I know, the Microsoft red team is really, really good. I have personally not had the privilege of working with them directly, at least not that I know of. But Apt emulation, yeah, that's tricky. I'll put it to you this way: if I was in charge of the Microsoft security program, I would be interested in doing red team assessments from all vantage points. I bristle at the thought of just being like emulation versus simulation. We have to pick one or the other. No, the answer is not really. And this is where the targeting and tailored aspect of a red team comes in. And really any firm that you're working with, you will get this experience at Trusted Sec, but if you're working with another good firm, any firm is going to be able to tailor the assessment to your needs because you have a good idea of what your value is. So if you're like, hey, we're a little weak with PowerShell detection for whatever reason, then say that to your testing team, because I get no greater pleasure than working with an organization that knows where they're weak. And sometimes I'll pull aside my point of contact and be like, listen, tell me where it hurts. And they'll be like, okay, listen, I got this application that's been around for 30 years and I can't get rid of it because it's like this just old boat anchor that keeps coming, upgrade to upgrade. What do we do? Can you help me figure this out? And I'm like, yes, tell me where it is. And then we will go after and help them move up their security that way. And so we have that ability to tailor that assessment. If I was Microsoft, I would be wanting to tailor those assessments heavily and move on, maybe yes, emulation, maybe off more into simulation, and just roll those all the time. So, but I'm not sure if that answer helps you there, Jim, but that's how I'd go about it.
I think that was a solid one for sure. I got another one. How does one get started in penetration testing? Is there a path you recommend or resource, or it naturally happens? So that is a very difficult and very open question. So both difficult and very open. So a lot of penetration testers typically have background in some other IT or infrastructure job. Typically, I would say, sysadmins, a lot of penetration testers are old school and very, very senior sysadmins. I would say Advar, is in our target operations teams has 15 plus years of experience administrating Windows machines, and he knows everything there is to know about Active Directory. And that was obviously like his starting getting into penetration testing. I don't think there is one specific resource or like one specific road or path to follow. Penetration testing is essentially hacking and attacking resources defined for you. And in order to do that, you need to set yourself into those resources and understand them and basically do a bunch of research and like, what should I say? Like, basically a bunch of research. I like to, when we do red teaming, I like to make the association that red teaming is basically like starting at a new company every 3 months. Every time you get a new red team engagement, you have to learn everything about that company. It's sort of like onboarding. You have to go through everything that you could possibly access in order to understand everything about that company. But everything's on the internet, Twitter and YouTube, and Hack the Box. I cannot recommend Hack the Box and Try Hack Me enough. Those are CTF platforms that are free. I basically teach you to hack in a very safe and a legal lab environment. So if you're interested in getting into penetration testing, I would definitely take a look at Try Hack Me, Hack the Box, as well as getting into our community Discord. There's a lot of very interesting people from all sorts of companies in the Trusted Sec Discord that will gladly help you and point you in the correct direction in terms of getting into the information security field.
Real quick, Manuel did have a question about start manually and then running automated scans. It's really preference here in terms of the best way to go about it. We generally like to start manually, and the reason why we like to start manually is because automation breeds mediocrity. The more automation you give yourself to, the more mediocre the results are going to be. And the further you get away from knowing the commands, knowing the arguments, knowing the tools, knowing the source code, the more mediocre you are going to be as a tester. And so, that's why I'm like, if you buy an internal pen test and they just run Nessus, and well, it's like, you're not getting what you're paying for. And so that's why, I am a fan of automation, but I am a fan of it in terms of coverage. And so, I like to do as much work as I can manually, and then use automation to possibly fill in any gaps. And so, great tools for that, Nessus, obviously, but also Nuclei is a fantastic one. And that's all, free and open source. So again, tester preference, but I like to stay closer to the tools and closer to the techniques than just, kicking off with Nessus and trusting the results.
Absolutely. I don't think we missed any other questions. I think we answered. Do you have any questions you want to talk about, Steve, that came in the chat, or do you want us to try to wrap it up?
Yeah, I think we're good. I think it's good to end here. We've got a lot of good questions in. You did a great job, Melvin. Really appreciate working on this, putting it together, and as many people have commented, very clear. We even had one that said he got more out of this than any of the classes he's taken in his college courses. So that's got to be a good thing. So with that, definitely want to thank you both and thank everyone for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.
Take care all. Thanks.
Take care.